How can reparations be transformative for women affected by war and violence? What types of reparations are needed? In this 5-part miniseries, we will explore these questions and more as we speak to experts in the field and hear the experiences of those to whom these answers matter most, women survivors. This dramatization is based on the experiences of women who live in war-affected provinces of the country. The following content includes sounds of violence and war that some listeners may find distressing.
There is a recurring dream I have. I'm at the door of my home when suddenly I drop to the floor. My brother lifts me to my feet. He begins to run and signals for me to follow him, but I can't move, and soon I can't see where he is. I first had that dream 13 years ago when my brother didn't come home. Soon after the war was over, we were told how to request information. They said we should first go to our local government officer and report our loved ones as missing. Then, I went the next day itself. I went alone because my parents were too old to travel. The officer was polite. I could tell he was an educated man, but he was not interested in my brother. Only me. I have not told anyone about what happened to me that day. My parents are gone now, and I still have no answers. All I have left are my dreams.
Hello, I'm Shyamala Gomez, the Executive Director of the Center for Equality and Justice. Welcome back to another episode in this series. Today we will discuss the violence continuum and how reparation fits in to this process. And we have with us Thyagi Ruwanpathirana. She is a researcher with a background in law and has worked on transitional justice, enforced disappearances, reparations for conflict-related sexual violence, and on memorialization issues. Welcome, Thyagi.
Thanks.
I will be asking you a few questions, and please feel free to elaborate in whatever way you wish to, and I will also come in with follow-up questions as well. So, for my first question, may I please ask you, in your opinion, can there be reparations for ongoing violence?
It's of course a tough one to say for certain, right? Because there's no right or wrong answer because it's so personal. It depends on the person who's gone through it. So essentially it depends on each case. But I would think there are things you can do in terms of reparations. So of course, like ceasing the violence, like a cessation of violence is a priority here because without this, the rest may not really amount to much. So there's that, but then there's also when you approach it, you have to think about safety and protection for the person going through it. So, before reparations, do you take this person out of this spot? How do you provide, protection? Is it internal relocation? Is it rehousing them with a neighbor? So there are different kinds of approaches you can take. So almost immediately you don't think of like truth, justice, non-recurrence. It's almost immediately your approach is, immediate safety. So we have to be mindful that, the full extent and the variety of gendered harms, which are like rooted in sex and gender-based discrimination, takes systemic changes, which also means it takes a lot of time. So that's, I think, where truth can play a very powerful tool here. Because, or even a remedy actually, because it can be exposés, it can be article, anything that kind of sheds light on the ongoing violence can be a helpful sort of catalyst. for justice, can be a catalyst for change. And I think that's where the sort of transformation point comes in. I think it can get worse if we don't stop the violence immediately. So I think when we approach it while truth and justice and all of that can be sort of more medium to longer term, I think immediate thing should be about trying to seize the violence to the effect we can. There would be short term, medium term, long term. So it's protection at the very beginning and then trying to effect long term and over time changes.
Just going back a little bit, do you want to kind of try and explain to us, in your opinion, what are the connotations of violence here? What are we talking about here? What kinds of violence are we talking about?
So it could be about, say, sexual and gender-based violence. It could be sexual violence in conflict. It can be even on disappearances. It can be extrajudicial killings. It could be bodily harm. So there could be, there's a wide range when we come to violence, but it's also not limited to physical harm. There's also mental harm that's very real because it has lasting repercussions. So I think it's also good to sort of approach this violence with like a very broad mind.
In terms of the violence continuum and how it affects or impacts on women specifically, do you think there's a difference in the way it the violence impacts on women rather than on men?
There is certainly a difference, but I wouldn't be able to say whether one is more important than the other. For example, I think when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence, especially conflict-related ones, towards men, it's almost the stigma is so much more for people to come out on. So if we look at it from that perspective, there's a different almost level that we need to look at it from. But of course, there's obviously, because we live in a society where there are gendered roles and kind of different approaches and cultural approaches to gender, there are certainly different ways these impacts of violence we can see in sort of everyday context.
Do you think that violence would also include, for example, the violence stemming from the Easter attacks and the subsequent sort of aftermath of the mob violence that took place, and the continuing violence that women, for example, undergo? You mentioned the trauma as well. Do you think that we can put that into the pot here in our discussion? Similarly, what about political violence? For example, the JVP violence of many years back. Would that be something that we should be looking at here as well when we talk about the continuum of violence?
I think so, because if you think about it, even if, say we take that person out of like a situation and the physical protection is provided, you still need to look at the other things like their mental well-being, the fact that, their main breadwinners would have been victims to attacks like this. How does that affect the family, the relationships? So there's a lot you need to think about, because there are different forms and variations in which the violence can affect a person's life. And yeah, you mentioned JVP as well. That's also a good one, because even now, that there are people who, especially during the COVID pandemic, and this is something we looked at also, that they were in a especially vulnerable spot, because not only were they in the over 60 aging category, they don't have their main breadwinners, they don't have access to their sons and daughters, so they had no income, they had no one to take care of them. It was especially difficult for them to step out. So like this violence, because of, say, enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings during that time, that affects their entire life, and especially in situations of pandemic, for example. So yeah, the violence very much continues in different forms.
So do you think the Easter attacks is also something that we should be talking about here?
No, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, you talked about, the different forms of violence and how this continues. If you think about the types of reparations that these victims would want in these circumstances, what are your views on that?
I think here also, because reparations are so broad and it's so personal, I think we need to really think of what is suitable for each person. And so that's why there's no like sort of one solution to this. Because of course we also have to look at like reparations in all its aspects, right? So there's obviously restitution in terms of compensation, how satisfied you would be, what the effect of like the reparation could be. Is it effective? Is it prompt? Rehabilitation, would that work in these situations? So I think those are aspects we need to consider when you're rolling out some kind of policy. But also we need to think about how we approach the question itself, because we don't want a situation where you're sort of worsening their situation by, for example, stigma is something we need to be really careful about, because if it's especially things like sexual violence, you need to be sort of in tune with their thinking. Do they want it to be public? Do they want it to not affect their lives? Do they not want their villagers to look at them the same way? Then, of course, there's also reprisals. If this comes out, what's the effect or impact it might have on their like physical protection? And then, of course, there's also re-traumatization. Some people find the process of telling the story itself a cathartic process, but then there's also a real harm that researchers like us could be doing in trying to get them to retell a story over and over again, especially when there's nothing much you can offer. So I think here again, there are different things you can do. Truth is, of course, a very powerful tool, but of course, for guarantees of non-recurrence, this can play a big role. So there can be legal changes you're seeking to effect. Then there could be security sector reform, getting the perpetrators responsible removed from those positions of power, and because it all sorts of things that you can do, because it needs to be a part of a larger solution as well, because you can't make sort of one-off changes and think that the problem itself would get fixed. So it's very individual, but I think there are elements we need to consider when we're trying to think of what type of reparation would be applicable to one case.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say that, because I think in some of CAJ's research also we found that women want different things, and also sometimes, because actually many times, in many instances, women have suffered multiple violations. It's not just one thing, so they have a sort of a layered it's sometimes horrific to actually listen to the stories that they talk about, about the multiple violations that they've been affected by, and even the reparations that they want are multifold. I mean, you want, different things, like the way you mentioned, it's a range of different forms of reparation. I think it would be interesting to look at also, you talked about non-recurrence and, reform of the security sector, etc. These are things that women have actually said, right? And I think it's really important that maybe when we have conversations on these types of reforms, that we include these women's voices in these reform process, which is really not done, I would think, in many countries. So thank you for raising that. Where should the most resources be allocated to? Do you think it should be for truth, for finding the truth, or to, seek justice for these women, or non-recurrence, or something else? What do you think?
Again, tough one, because I think, in the earlier question we also discussed the kind of and the form of reparation, right? Like, how subtle do you want it to be? Do you want reparations to be reparations, or do you want it to take a different form altogether? Because truth itself is reparative. There are memorialization effects that can be reparative. So I think and we do have a tendency as lawyers also to romanticize the notion of justice, right? So whether that sense of taking somebody to court, of course, understanding that there would not be a willingness sometimes to expose yourself as a victim, and the fact that you might face real repercussions and reprisals for it. But what kind of satisfaction do you get out of a judicial process? Do you have faith in the system? So there are many sort of very personal and individual approaches you have to consider. And this is why I think for a reparations policy, it'll be very interesting to consider where you sort of put your money. And I think, again, I think truth and guarantees of non-recurrence in a way are sort of, for me at least, very on the top two. Even if justice isn't something that, ideally, but we also don't know the deterrent effect of justice, because there is so little done on achieving justice for these kind of cases, especially for women, because you need to first have access to a police officer or an investigation body that's willing to write down your complaint. Then you have to have enough faith in them acting on that without trying to cover that up. And then you have to have faith in the judicial process where the Attorney General's office or an independent office of the prosecutor is able to actually prosecute the case. And that would require you to have a set of laws that's going to be useful. It could be the fact that there'll be a statute of limitations. It could be the fact that the laws might not cover the breadth of the violence. And then you have to have faith in the process that, you will get justice at the end of it. And then, after everything you've gone through as a victim, do you want to put yourself through this long sort of drawn out process, especially in countries like Sri Lanka, where justice systems are very, very flawed, and these are very long drawn out processes. So I would say, for example, unless people have enough faith in the justice system and the process itself is effective, I would personally put my sort of priorities as truth and non-recurrence.
Do you think that, something like urgent reparations would be something that we could consider looking at? I mean, it might end up being very ad hoc, but, you're at least addressing the women, their concerns, the harm, etc., immediately, or, in the near future, rather than waiting for a proper reparations process to sort of, be formulated. Do you think that is an option?
I definitely think so. And this is also why it was a recommendation in the OMP's first interim report that came out, where they said, they didn't even call it reparations. They just said interim relief. And they were able to sort of discuss with government officials and figure out how much can you actually provide a month as a monthly income for people whose main breadwinner has gone missing or disappeared. So that itself, it wasn't much at all. I think people laughed at the amount. But I think it's a start. It's interim relief. It wasn't reparations. So I think that sort of like almost at least puts you in a place where you're able to do something, because otherwise the very act of trying to find truth for your missing loved ones or going to court for anything, those things take a lot of expenses. You need to leave your family, your daily wage, and come get on a bus and spend all that money and time pursuing these systems. And that itself takes so much effort. So I think this helps a lot. I think, that's these policy changes and coming up with these structures are important, but it's probably going to fall in the medium to long term column for me. So I think as an immediate something that would help is definitely interim relief or reparations.
I think I just like to add to that also. I think it might be, you may agree with that, the fact that you need to deal with the trauma that these women have gone through and the mental health repercussions that they continue to face over long periods of time, sometimes after 20 years. So I think, that also is something that can be addressed without too much resources being allocated for, that process. So, maybe that is something that we can consider as well. What do you think? What are last thoughts?
Yeah, I think definitely. And that's why it was such a pity to find out that there was so little psychosocial workers allocated in the North. This is a area coming out of a war, a 30-year war, and you didn't have free mental health services. And it's already an issue, and there's stigma trying to get kind of support for those kind of things. And then where you are willing to get it, the facility is not available. So I think psychosocial support should be one of the main things also, that policies and kind of any kind of solution should really work their way into it. And it could also be that, when just in the process of having a conversation with someone, even for our interviews sometimes, it's like if you are talking to somebody about a traumatizing event, then you should probably have a psychosocial worker that they can speak with in the event that they expose themselves too much, or they feel like they need to talk to somebody about it, because all these emotions come out and they have a lasting impact.
Thank you, Thyagi. I think, what you did today was really ground, the podcast in a way that we are looking at the reality now, at the ground realities, and how we can really apply the principles, the global principles on reparations to a country such as Sri Lanka. And, looking at, I think it was a reality check, in other words, on what is possible in this country, and and how we set about trying to ensure that women get the due reparations that they need on an urgent basis. So thank you for joining us today, and we wish you the best in your work.
Thanks, Shyamala. I just also want to add as like a final thought, it's just that it's not just working on the reparation itself, it's attitudinal change is super important to be able to make this systemic change. So awareness raising, talking about stigma, making it less taboo, those are things that would be really important and help people to come out. So I really appreciate you. This itself is a forum where you're doing that. So I really appreciate you taking this initiative and having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Thyagi.
This podcast series was brought to you by the Center for Equality and Justice. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss an episode.